let's take retirement income planning, right? You have your objectives. Within objectives, you have liquidity. You want to make sure you always have emergency money. You have legacy issues that could be important, that could not be. You have discretionary things you want to accomplish, and you have essential things that you want to make sure that you have. So you have those 4 buckets. And if you see the world in that framework, then a lot of decisions can become a lot easier because you fall back on that framework as opposed to making decisions on the fly.
I'm James Matthews, and this is the Intelligent Retirement Podcast, a show dedicated to helping busy professionals take the guesswork out of planning for retirement. I've spent nearly 2 decades studying retirement, so you don't have to. So turn it up, because your retirement's about to get a whole lot smarter in 3, 2, 1. Have you ever known someone who researches a decision endlessly but never pulls the trigger? Maybe it's a friend who's been buying a car for 2 years, or the one who swears he's about to start working out just as soon as he finds the perfect gym. We see the same thing all the time in retirement planning. People gather information, they ask a friend what they did, or maybe even meet with an advisor for guidance, and then nothing. No action. That's the status quo bias at work. You see, sticking with what's familiar feels safer than making a change, even when all the facts and logic say otherwise. The problem? In retirement, delaying key financial decisions can cost you. The rules of spending from a lifetime of accumulated savings are different, and what got you to retirement is unlikely to be what successfully gets you through retirement. After nearly 2 decades helping real people with these issues, I've learned that a successful retirement often comes down to just getting a couple of things right and avoiding a couple of mistakes along the way. Our job here on the Intelligent Retirement Podcast is to help you know the difference between the two. That's where today's guest, Alex Murguia, comes in. Alex is a principal at both Retirement Researcher and McLean Asset Management. He and co-founder Wade Pfau created the Retirement Income Style Awareness, RISA, framework, which helps people discover their retirement income personality and how they prefer to implement financial advice. Alex earned his Ph.D. in clinical psychology from the George Washington University and has published numerous peer-reviewed articles in leading financial industry journals. He is also a frequent speaker at many financial planning conferences. In today's episode, we'll dive into why smart people get stuck in analysis paralysis when it comes to money, the 4 retirement income styles, and how knowing yours can help you take action, and how understanding your own implementation style can help you follow through on a plan. So if you've ever found yourself second-guessing a financial decision or wondering why you know you need to plan for retirement but keep kicking the can down the road, this is the episode for you. One last thing. Here's a quick reminder that this show is sponsored by Consolidated Planning. Since 1981, Consolidated Planning has served clients nationwide with a collaborative approach that ensures all of your financial planning needs are met by a team of experts. Visit cplanning.com and click the Find an Advisor button for the office nearest you or to schedule a virtual consultation. And with that, here's my conversation with Alex Murguia. Alex Murguia, welcome to the Intelligent Retirement Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, James.
Absolutely. You're looking quite healthy and fit. What's your secret?
A lot of pickleball. A lot of pickleball.
I love it. Staying active. That's important for sure. Well, you look great.
Thank you, man. But thinking about fit. I mean, what time did you get up this morning?
You know what time? 4:20.
I don't know how you do that. You're like an Amish farmer or something like that. Did you ever see the movie Suspect? I think it was Suspect with Harrison Ford.
Witness. Yeah.
Witness. Yeah. Suspect. Was that another movie that he did?
It might have been. I don't know. Yeah, Witness.
Yeah. Witness, when he gets up at 4 a.m, John Wook, something like that. Time for milking. It was hilarious.
Well, let's just dive in. Today I want to talk about one of the papers that you wrote with your co-author, Wade Pfau. And the paper is called Retirement Income Beliefs and Financial Advice Seeking Behaviors. And I'll link to it in the show notes for our audience if they want to go check it out. But before we get into that, will you share a little bit about just your background and how you got involved in the field of retirement planning, just to kind of set this up a little bit for us?
Yeah. Effectively, by education, I'm a clinical psychologist, doctorate in clinical psychology. And to get a PhD in clinical psychology, there's this dual track. There's a scientist and there's a practitioner. Practitioner is when you're you're focusing on therapy. You want to be a counselor effectively. And the scientist is more, you're interested in research, intervention programs, and the like. But to pursue that degree, you have to do a good bit of both. Myself, I had a proclivity towards the research part of it. I don't consider myself, if you will, a therapist. It's something about empathy that I was lacking that, it's a muscle that I atrophied now. Just kidding. It's one of those that I was more along that track. And so with that, what you really get ingrained with is the scientific method and how to conduct the study and the like. And, long story short, by the time I graduated, I became enamored with investments. And that was effectively my research track that I wanted to pursue. Lo and behold, one thing leads to another. And voila, I have an RIA, McLean Asset Management.
Very logical transition. You go to school, get a doctorate in psychology, and go into the investment business. Got it.
Dude, it gets even worse. I was a film major.
Even better.
And I just stumbled the whole Suspect Witness movie titles, but so it goes.
Well, it's been a few years now, so that's all good.
There you go.
So it kind of get us into the topic of the paper. The basic premise was really that you were looking at how people who are looking to retire go about seeking advice.
Yeah, it was the paper was hand in hand with another one that we had written about retirement income preferences, trying to identify retirement income styles. But we felt, Wade Pfau and myself co-authored these. We felt that it's one thing to identify, what style someone wants with regards to identifying, let me say a better word, a retirement income plan. But you still, as advisors, the thing that was troubling is no one implements. Well, that's a broad statement. Folks implement, but you've always had the prospect that a year later comes in after doing a financial plan and never became a client and says, hey, I'm back, I'm ready to get going. And you're like, well, that's a long time. We have to review this again. And so that always fascinated me, this sort of the pause that happens in between. Why don't they implement? And it was one of those things that actually in psychology, in my research doing my dissertation, that was something that actually concerned me quite a bit. Implementation of health advice that doctors were providing to patients. Why isn't that followed through upon? And so I guess that was a thread that was loose and I wanted to pursue it, but within the financial services industry. And we thought not only identifying preferences are important, but that's just half the battle. The other half is actually getting them to do that, getting them to implement. And so we became fascinated with that. And that's what led to that research.
Got it. Do you want to talk a little bit about the RISA that you and Wade put together and kind of how those two ideas fit together in terms of what that is?
Sure. Yeah. And the RISA stands for Retirement Income Style Awareness. And the whole genesis of that was Wade and I were getting a lot of questions from people listening to the content that we put out there, asking us, hey, should we do this or should we do that? And the answer is really, it depends. So Wade and I wanted to do a deep dive into what does it depend on so we can give folks a satisfying answer. And that led to, the proverbial rabbit hole of, well, let's get to it, right? And within that, we discovered there were two factors that largely indicate how somebody wants to source retirement income. Probability safety first, optionality, commitment orientation, right? And those factors, they're on this sort of spectrum. Probability safety first, to cut to the chase, is probability is I believe in the probabilities that an investment will increase over time. And that allows me to take a withdrawal rate from it without, quote unquote, depleting the wealth. Safety first is I get all of that, but I don't want to be tied to the market when I retire. And I understand time diversification and the like. But for my essential expenses, I want to offload that liability on somebody else's balance sheet and really get contractual income. Simply put, that's what that is. And so you juxtapose that, you bring in here optionality and commitment orientation. Optionality being, I like to keep my options open. I don't like to lock in on something because that's just not my temperament. I like to see things as they come. And if there's an opportunity to improve, I want to be able to maximize that and the like. Commitment orientation is just the flip side of that coin, which is, listen, if I can solve an issue for the rest of my life right now, I'm going to lock that in. Yes, things may get better, but things may also get worse, and I have no way of knowing which way it's going to land, and so I want to lock in on that. And so if you take those two factors, you can begin to really identify retirement income styles. So, to make it very short, probability safety first. If you're probability and optionality oriented, let me say it that manner, that's really somebody that is very comfortable taking withdrawal rates from an investment portfolio because it really echoes those two factors. Now, if you're commitment oriented and safety first, well, that's more, you really prefer contractual income for a retirement income in terms of playing a significant role. That being the case, that's just identifying a strategy. Then again, Wade and I thought, well, how do you get them over that finish line, if you will? How do they run through the tape on implementing this? And we realized, we don't know that we need to assess what types of personality factors that are more generalized as opposed to safety first and probability based, which is really more localized for retirement income. We wanted to assess what general personality factors may indicate implementation preferences. And we wanted to go beyond like the big 5 trades and things like that. We really wanted to get more localized just to see what gives, frankly.
Well, I can tell you as a practitioner, somebody who's been doing this a long time, that's something that always gave me pause as well, thinking about people, like you've said, who come get your advice, right, and take the advice and never implement. What good is that really doing, or is that really helping people? So I was really glad to see when this research came out a few years ago that you were approaching it from that angle. And I think, to your point just now, having an understanding of both the preferences around the retirement income, but also around how clients would prefer to implement advice is pretty valuable to both clients and advisors. Is that what you found?
Yeah, I found that consumers didn't realize that this is even a thing, frankly. It's that whole in marketing, there's problem unaware, and how do you get them from problem unaware to problem aware to solution aware, et cetera, right? And so folks just didn't know that there are many credible strategies that are available. There is no one ring to rule them all, if you will. And I think that's what they come in thinking, frankly. And that's me anecdotally saying that. I don't believe consumers are aware that, hey, there's roughly 4 styles that cover all potential retirement income strategies: total return, income protection, risk wrap, which is, I want market exposure, but with floors, if you will, and time segmentation, which is more of that bucketing approach, right? All of those are credible. Frankly, there's not one that you could say this is the best, and there's not one that you can say this is foolishness. And so I think once you get to that, our job as advisors is really identify where the client is coming from and see if we can begin the process from there. And I say begin the process purposefully. I don't mean rubber stamp the process. And so I think consumers, when they realize that, they feel, wow, I'm being heard. And for advisors, we've gotten 2 reactions, and they're not equally weighted. The most consistent reaction we get is, you know what? It clicks. I think you're right. If I can approach the solution based on where they're coming from, my odds of success are much greater. And also, I'm doing a better version of my job in the sense of, hey, you can have any jacket you want as long as it's green, kind of thing. I think they're realizing that that's not the way to go. But there is a subset of advisors. I was speaking to a large institutional firm, and they had a subset of advisors. And we were talking about this, and one of them said, yeah, but the clients don't know what's best for them. I know. And, why don't, I'm going to convince them to go in this manner. And that person wasn't saying it in a nefarious manner. It was just, hey, this is the way to do it. And, if you don't like it, pound sand kind of thing. And I think that's wrong in many ways, simply because there's many ways to get to a solution for retirement income planning. Again, the reactions weren't equally weighted. Most of the advisors have that aha moment, as do many consumers, if you will.
To that point, you've got advisors who are maybe somewhat agnostic about the approach, and they're more willing to explore different pathways, if you want to call it that, maybe with their clients, versus others who are more entrenched in a particular philosophy. And I think in some ways, both can work. But there's certainly been a push in the last several years to more of the human behavioral finance type of approaches across financial planning pretty broadly. And I think what you're describing really fits into that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I've seen the behavioral finance stuff being conveyed within our industry in a very particular way right now, which is how to improve the relationships during a meeting, how to really be empathetic, and the like. And the goal towards that is to, making a connection quicker with a client. And I think that's great. And how to listen to the client better. The more your listening muscle increases, the better outcomes you will have, simply because that person will be more inclined to open up to you, will be more inclined to do certain things. I think when it gets to intervention, I think that's a very, very tough job. that's something that, when you're looking at it, I'm almost like, I want no part of that. Not because I don't think it's important, but because I think that's very, very difficult from the standpoint of an advisor only spends so many times with the client, whereas a therapist is, at least at the beginning of that relationship, is seeing this person consistently on a weekly basis. And an intervention program is very tough to pull off simply because if you're with them 1 hour every quarter at most, relative to the 24/7 of their lives, you're really not going to have that much impact. This isn't where you're going to touch somebody's head and say, Satan, release this person. That just doesn't happen. And so from that vantage point, I think that's tough. It's a very noble thing that they're trying to do, getting interventions from that standpoint. But I think what the RISA does and what the corresponding persona stuff does is that it really, really brings, I don't know if there's something out there, James, I just haven't seen it, where it integrates the behavior finance inside of a financial planning rubric, if you will. And so to me, that makes it a little more practical from a financial planning standpoint. Look, as a psychologist in training, it's no different than if a psychologist takes some sort of 2-week course on financial planning and then starts delivering financial advice. I think the financial planning industry would be like, this is crazy, in the same point that if a financial advisor takes some sort of, month-long webinar on something with regards to financial psychology and then fancies themselves a financial therapist. I think that's tricky in that sense. That's not to say I discount the whole thing. I think it's very important to really know how to listen and have successful meetings and the like, because again, anything that disarms and opens up the conversation is fantastic.
Yeah. And everybody has their own biases, right? I mean, you brought up financial therapy, like what they would call money scripts in financial therapy verbiage, which is based on our background and our experiences, right? We all carry that around with us. But given that, how can listeners avoid some of the negative effects of some of the more common biases that you've seen, like things like loss aversion or recency bias, when they're putting together a retirement income strategy based on what you have found out from the research?
Well, there's a couple of things there from our research. What we wanted to see is what types of potential biases affect implementation, right? And so Wade and I actually created a scale that, put together all the biases, and we created questions around that. You said like loss aversion, herd mentality, anchoring, et cetera, right? And when we did that, we thought we had, okay, these are the 7 most popular biases. Let's see, and we created questions for each of those biases, and we assessed, okay, which one of those is more prominent than the other when it comes to implementing. And what we found is that all those biases really form one big cluster. We ran what's called exploratory factor analysis to see if these were distinguishable biases and the like. And you didn't really see that. You saw that there's a general bias cloud, if you will, which is fine from that standpoint. And what we found is that it does play a role in the cadence of the conversation that an advisor can have with folks. For instance, there were some folks that a high level of generalized financial biases indicated a higher level of retirement income anxiety, which makes total sense. And so from an advisor standpoint, the rule of the game is, how can you maybe try to deflate that anxiety in a manner that person is going to be listening to you when you're speaking to them, so it doesn't come across that you're like in those Charlie Brown cartoons, the wah, 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 kind of voice while that person's not really listening. So there's certain things that can be done with that. But I think by far the most important one is an advisor provides a framework. What a financial plan is great at is providing this temporal discounting. You're kind of showing, okay, future casting, this is what it could look like, 30 years from now. And so let's back into that. And you back into that with a financial plan. But even then, if you have an overarching framework with which to work with, you're going to do much better. Why? Because these biases have been ingrained in our system for over 300,000 years. I mean, it's evolutionary from the standpoint of loss aversion exists for a reason. You wanted to survive in the savannah, right? We're social beings, right? So we're going to have things like herd mentality and things like that simply because that's part of our thing. And we're naturally always going to have proclivities for these mental shortcuts, which, in the positive, you can say they're shortcuts. In the negative, you can call them biases. Why? Because the brain, it's like 2% of your body weight, but takes up 20% of your calories. And so it's hard to fight against that. And that's the conclusion that all these, behavioral finance guys will tell you at the end of the day, yes, we have biases, but there's really not a lot you can do to overcome them. And so how do you work within them? And you work within them by creating this sort of framework around planning. Let's take retirement income planning, right? You have your objectives. You have liquidity. You want to make sure you always have emergency money. You have legacy issues that could be important, that could not be. You have discretionary things you want to accomplish, and you have essential things that you want to make sure that you have. So you have those 4 buckets. And really, to fund those buckets, you have a couple of options, right? You have contractual income, you have investment sources, and you have effectively insurance, risk mitigation for liquidity kind of things. And if you see the world in that framework, then a lot of decisions can become a lot easier because you fall back on that framework as opposed to making decisions on the fly. And to me, the financial plan becomes the numerical expression of the framework I just spoke about. And that helps a lot in terms of creating that foundation to tell the client, listen, this is what we have here. When the proverbial quote unquote hits the fan, this is what we're deciding to do. And you'd be surprised. That's not by any means a panacea, magic, but it's better than doing things on the fly. Like, you had NVIDIA go down $600 billion, right? I would imagine without a plan in place, a lot of mistakes were made.
Yeah, I think great points there. Biases can be such a dirty word sometimes, right? I think we may hear that word and think it's a negative thing. I think what you're describing is it's just an explanation for how and why we think and act the way we do, right? Is that fair based on our past experience?
Yeah, and I'm using the words simply how I was taught, if you will. I'm not expressing a negative value, a negative valence, if you will, towards biases. And much the same way when I use the word discriminate, it just means the ability to tell things apart from a pure scientific standpoint. I remember I got in a huge argument with my mother-in-law when I used the word discriminate in a regular sentence. And I was like, no, I'm just meaning here to separate 2 variables. I'm just speaking from pure clinical standpoint.
I think there's this tendency among some aspects of the financial advisor community to have this idea that, if you just work with me, I'll show you how to do it right. I'll show you the right way to do things. And that seems to be a lot of how at least the marketing I see out there approaches it. But your study really found that individuals overestimate their own financial literacy in some cases. So how can advisors help people address that without alienating people using perhaps charged language like you're saying?
Well, what we found in our thing is we wanted to study numeracy, not necessarily financial literacy. Numeracy is more jeopardy with numbers. Financial literacy is jeopardy with, hey, what's the Roth conversion workflow or something like that? What's the maximum you can contribute?
Math versus facts.
Yeah, math. Yeah, that's a great way of saying it. I should use that. Math versus facts, right? And so we wanted to do numeracy to see how that affects implementation because, the thinking was, hey, if someone has a good command of numbers, then they can absorb the facts. They're probably smart enough to absorb the facts. And so let's see what would happen. I didn't write this in the study because we just didn't want to, frankly. But in our study, we had a good number of advisors and consumers. And believe it or not, well, we were doing this on Retirement Researcher, which is a website. This was a bias sample. And so for this part, and so we asked people that were members of our community, if you will, and we're talking 10,000 plus. And we have a good helping of advisors in that community. So where you were going with that question could have been, hey, the advisors have this better knowledge of how numbers work. We didn't necessarily find that to be the case. And in fact, there's that construct of Dunning-Kruger, where when you give somebody a numeracy questionnaire, if you ask them afterwards, hey, how do you think you did? And then how do you think you did also relative to others? What you find is that the folks that performed the worst thought they did the best on both of those questions. And the folks that did the best actually underestimated their, how they did the most. Can advisors help folks that are low in numeracy and the like? I'm not so sure. I don't have as much confidence in advisors, actually, based on what we saw. I mean, where advisors have the edge is in the facts part of it, not necessarily in the numeracy part of it, at least for, individuals that are interested already in financial planning, if you will.
Sure. And I think that might explain some of why there are courses of study, the RICP program at the American College being one of them, that have really started to focus explicitly on retirement income as it's kind of its own thing, because just so much about it is so different than a lot of the traditional rules of thumb kind of based financial planning that people are more familiar with. I think that's maybe the more of the fact-based part of it you're talking about. In a world where fortune cookie advice and rules of thumb have dominated the mainstream, I think what you're describing explains, frankly, a lot of things that we see people doing it can be costly mistakes when it comes to making decisions about retirement.
This episode is sponsored by Consolidated Planning. Since 1981, Consolidated Planning has helped families organize, protect, and grow their wealth with its protection-first philosophy and unique approach to planning designed to maximize your living standard in retirement. Take the first step toward a more confident financial future by visiting www.cplanning.com. That's the letter C, planning.com. And now, back to our show.
In the study also, something that kind of jumped out at me was that some of these folks that you're talking about with the lower numeracy scores also actually viewed advisors as either unnecessary or too expensive to work with. And so for these folks in particular, what alternatives or what kind of innovations in the financial services industry do you see resonating most with these folks?
Sure. There's a short answer where I can get right to that one, or there's a longer answer where I can provide the context, for what my answer will be. The short answer is if someone thinks that they're ultimately as knowledgeable as an advisor because they have a high level of numeracy, which is, they feel competent in terms of doing that, and they don't feel that an advisor's relationship is cost effective, I think that's an immediate closed loss for an advisor, and I wouldn't spend too many calories on that. So my short answer is I wouldn't do anything with them. I'd maybe point them to areas where they can, get more information and get educated on the questions that they have. And that, in my estimation, is the best you can do.
There's always going to be a subset of folks that are just more comfortable doing things themselves. And I think that's okay. And I think that there are models that are starting to adapt out there that are accommodative of that, where, you found, I think, in some of your results that there were a group of people who kind of wanted to have the option of checking in with an advisor periodically. But yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how consumers can recognize how they might go about seeking out an advisor that matches their particular preferences? It's like the difference between a delegator or somebody self-directed.
Yeah, I got you. Yeah. Well, what we did with the RISA, we talked about two factors for retirement income preferences. First one being the main one is advisor usefulness. And there are plenty of studies about advisor alpha and how advisor adds value and things like that. The cynic in me is those studies are great, frankly. Great, like from a methodology standpoint. I have no quarrel with them at all. But if I hand that to a client or prospect, it looks like marketing material. Because, hey, look how great I am. Here's a study to show it. That kind of thing. So what we wanted to assess was really cost effectiveness. Advisor usefulness in the sense of, is it an advisor? Sure. Everyone can agree to some extent that the advisor adds value. But does it add value beyond the cost? Right? That's the bogey. So is he or she cost effective, right? So we call that advisor usefulness. And then the other one is self-efficacy, and that's a localized construct. The one that people, I think, confuse a lot with self-efficacy is confidence. Confidence is a generalized construct of, yes, I feel great about my ability to do things, right? Self-efficacy is localized for the task at hand. The example that I always say is, for me, I'm terrible at home repairs and things like that. I literally don't do anything around the house when it comes to fixing things. I get the sense you're different, James. In fact, my wife does a lot of that stuff. And frankly, when it gets beyond her ken, we just call somebody to do it. And not that, again, I can't figure out how to do something. I just, to me, it's work. I don't want to do it. And I think I'll mess it up because I'm not passionate enough to do it well. So that's self-efficacy. So my self-efficacy on that kind of stuff is on the floor. Now, my self-efficacy with regards to, let's say, retirement income is quite high. And so if you take advisor usefulness and you create a matrix, if you will, advisor usefulness on one side and self-efficacy on the other, you get interesting combinations, right? Someone that's high in self-efficacy and low in advisor usefulness, that's a self-directed person, right? So now let's get to the validator. Someone that's low in self-efficacy, but also low in advisor usefulness, that's someone that thinks there's going to be certain inflection points that I'm going to need help in, but I don't want that help on an ongoing basis, right? I just want to check in and then check out. I'll implement. That's a validator. Those are those folks that maybe just want a financial plan and they'll try to implement it themselves. Obviously, we spoke earlier why that's going to be difficult, but again, it is what it is,
Yeah,
right?
it's a preference, right?
The other piece is that could be a transaction that person wants. Hey, give me an allocation. I'll go to Schwab and do it. Hey, let me have access to this annuity based on the financial plan. And once I get it, I'm in good shape, right? It kind of is good for those relationships. If you have somebody with low self-efficacy and high advisor usefulness, well, that's a delegator, right? And that's somebody that wants to outsource this. A lot of folks think a delegator is somebody that thinks, well, money's kryptonite. They can't figure it out. They have low numeracy, that kind of thing. But there's also the case where I'm retired. I don't want the aggravation. I want to go out and play pickleball all day, that kind of thing. All right. And so they're going to outsource it because that person can devote more time to what they want to do. And so those are delegators. Now, if someone that has high self-efficacy, but also thinks an advisor is very useful from a cost-effective standpoint, those are collaborators. That's somebody that wants to be part of the team. If I had you as a client, James, I'm sure every meeting you would have 10 bullet points of things that you wanted to discuss,
That's fair. Yep.
Right? And that's fine. It's your money. I think advisors also forget it's their assets,
Sure.
But you would probably, I know your personality and your temperament, you would do it in a manner that respects the competence of the advisor you're working with. And you see this almost as a team thing and a division of labor more than anything else.
Yeah.
Right. And those are collaborators. And frankly, I think collaborators on balance make better clients. This is me anecdotal now. I think they make better clients than delegators because the danger with delegators sometimes is that they forget about it. And 5 years later, they're like, what the hell's going on here? And may move on. Whereas a collaborator, if you have that good rhythm, those are really sticky clients.
What I was thinking as you were saying that was that I think there's kind of maybe a tendency amongst financial advisors, so I'm pointing the finger at myself here a little bit too, to really only consider maybe the delegators or maybe collaborator-oriented people, consumers, as, quote unquote, good clients, right? Or ideal clients. But I think what I'm hearing, I think, though, is that there's really room for service models for advisors to adapt to working with really all four types. But it just may be that how you approach the situation or how you deliver your services may be a little more modular or maybe a little more piecemeal or even in some cases, maybe a little more transactional if that's what the client is looking for. And that's okay as long as everybody is in agreement that is desirable and that's what everybody is seeking. I think my takeaway from that would be as long as the advice or as long as the transactional component is in the client's best interest, like that's probably better than the client not getting the advice at all or not implementing the advice they're getting. Is that fair, do you think?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. As an industry, we anchor the best option as being a total return strategy. And you're right, 100%. But that's the problem with our industry. We think that they're better approaches. And no, what happens is we conflate business models with approaches. And we need to divorce ourselves from that. Yeah. We really do. Because I think at the end of the day, it's about transparency, in my estimation. I think, again, there are many credible strategies to accomplish a successful retirement income approach. And it should be anchored in the client's preferences and then overlaid with the economic viability of that approach. And if it can be done, then ding, ding, winner, winner, chicken dinner. If it can't, then you expand the purview of potential solutions, but think of it as concentric circles, from where it started from.
Yeah.
That's the best way I can answer that in terms of how somebody should maybe approach the planning paradigm, from a relationship standpoint. Not the I know best and you should do what I'm telling you. Because if you put yourself in the client's position, a consumer's position, I don't believe they are aware of there's various strategies to accomplish what you want to do.
Yeah.
By no means, if we asked, hey, total return approach, what is it? Risk wrap, what is it? Income protection, what is it? Time segmentation, what is it? And we put a financial literacy score around that. I mean, that would be 0 for consumers.
Yeah.
if your advisors wouldn't get 100 either, frankly, I think, again, they would profess extreme knowledge about their business model approach, but that's probably about it. And I'm speaking in generalities, so
Sure.
I don't mean to offend anyone. I'm just speaking in generalities because, it is what it is. And so from that standpoint, I think if you were to approach it from this agnostic approach, I can't help but think the consumer would really appreciate the ability to kind of anchor the plan based on what they want. And if the advisor can go around that, I think that's the method to do it. And then that opens up a lot of business, a lot of avenues, if you will, that the person can approach. You can have a niche, right? I have a niche on retirement income planning for corporate executives for XYZ company, right? That's fine. But not everyone within that company is going to want the same retirement income approach. And if you can handle that within your infrastructure, I would definitely pursue that with extreme prejudice, simply because it's beneficial for you. That has changed our firm, McLean Asset Management, tenfold. When we started this approach, we were largely a total return shop. We didn't think anything of it. We just thought, well, this is the way to do it. And whenever anyone wanted anything else, we would refer it out. But largely we were that. And hey, look, 100% of our book is following this approach, so it's right. What we didn't realize is maybe some people didn't want that, in the same way that someone went from active management to passive management for the investment portfolios over time. Hey, science moves forward and you need to accommodate that.
So it sounds like what I'm hearing to kind of sum that up is just that from a consumer's perspective, right? So for our listening audience that maybe aren't working with an advisor or they haven't gotten that far down the pathway yet, that really seeking out advisors who are even-handed in their approach or balanced, or use the word agnostic, but able to look at all available options with a dispassionate third-party interest so that they can then help the client develop and implement whatever the right strategy for that client is without being hamstrung by either business models or other factors that really aren't particularly relevant to the client. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. What I would like to add is, and I challenge every advisor, are you providing the advice that's anchored in what the client's preferences are? Or are you providing the advice that's effectively, if this were me, this is what I would do? And if you're doing that, if this were me, this is what I would do, I think you have to check yourself a little bit.
Yeah. How can consumers, as they're seeking advisors or if they're interviewing advisors, what kinds of things should they be thinking of or asking their advisors or potential advisors about?
Whenever anyone speaks to you in absolutes, I think that's always a red flag. And then you trickle down from there.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. If you could change one thing about just the industry or about the way things tend to work today to better serve the different personas that you've identified, so thinking like the different types of consumers you're describing, what one thing do you think that we could change tomorrow, if possible, to better serve all of them collectively?
I think if we have a focus on transparency and on transparency on the business models and why this one is better than the other, that kind of thing, that's just my opinion. There's much gray in there, but
Sure.
If you remove that part of it, I think advisors would be significantly more open to considering all credible options. An example would be I was speaking to an advisor and he's telling me, well, on a spreadsheet, this strategy versus that strategy makes no sense, right? 2 points. I challenge that spreadsheet because, on a couple of reasons, research shows differently, but also people don't optimize their life on an Excel sheet. Right. And that advisor was inherently confusing. Hey, one is actually an insurance product. One is actually an investment product. And you're comparing the insurance product to an investment product, and they're not the same. But you're kind of telling me this with this level of quote unquote confidence that's just not there. That shouldn't be there. Mm-hmm. Because obviously over the course of time, I'm sure at some point you had to get your credentials and take a test and show that you had knowledge about everything. But it's apparent that at this point in your professional trajectory, you've kind of stopped sharpening that sword and you've kind of gotten in one bubble of what you want to provide. And so to me, if you bring in this transparency of business models and you show, listen, there's many credible ways to get this, I think that will change a lot. Simply put, that will change a lot. That and giving everyone AI agents to have be their own personal advisor. That would be my snap of the finger.
There you go. What areas of behavioral finance and within the scope of retirement planning do you feel like further exploration or further research is warranted at this point to help continue to push this idea of retirement income planning forward? Or have we reached the final frontier at this point?
No, I think there are a lot. There are areas there for the taking. I mean, if I wanted to pursue this further, I would. The thing is, my area wouldn't be just specifically to behavioral finance, because I think in and of itself, there's not a lot of practicality unless you're marrying it with financial planning best practices, from that vantage point. But I would love to be able to begin to discern how we can present planning better, and are certain biases more resistant to certain implementation strategies. It's really how to marry the biases, not to fight against them, but rather to see how you can sort of take these biases and provide implementation paths that are actually more efficacious than just saying, okay, this is the issue, and this is what you need to do because I know best, and that's it. I think right now there's a lot of exploration in improving that conversations, because those things will never get implemented. But there's also the path of, what traits is this person manifesting? And couples, really, not just the person. What traits are these couples manifesting with that we can provide implementation paths for them moving forward? Something we didn't talk about, one of the factors that gets lost a lot, and a lot of folks will say, hey, look, this could be just as important as loss aversion, is this idea of inertia, right? And to me, if I wasn't running a business, if I was on I'm a university professor and I have tenure and I don't have to worry about anything, I would really study inertia and its effect on implementation, because I think that's a huge, huge construct that frankly just flies under the radar.
When you say inertia, are you referring to like just the status quo, sort of people that just keep doing what they're doing because that's what they're doing?
Yeah, keep doing what they're doing because that's what they're doing. The people that kind of, hey, you should have done an estate plan 5 years ago, like we talked about, what's going on here? And a lot of work has been done that no one's going to move forward because of what you said, the status quo. And if what you're suggesting is just marginally better or perceived as marginally better, they're just not going to do. And I'm sure this happens to you. It happens to me. It happens to you in other aspects of life, right?
Absolutely.
And so that's something that I think is fascinating for me. Like, when is that switch flipped?
Yeah, you mentioned medicine earlier, and I know there's been other research. Moira Summers is one that comes to mind, her book for advisors, Advice That Sticks, but it really goes into looking at how people prefer to take recommendations and either implement them or not implement them. And there's a great parallel to the medical community with doctors and patients, and doctors giving you health advice, change your diet, exercise more, all those things that people then don't go do. And I think that would be a very interesting area to study, because I think what I'm hearing you say is that by taking the approaches from the RISA part of it, right, the income style preferences, but also with a deep understanding of the type of individual you're working with and their preferences to actually implement things. If we can get both of those things right, then advisors and clients will both, be in a much better position to actually move the needle on retirement security, those things that are, I think, the bigger issues.
I'm fully in agreement with you. I'd love to get that book afterwards. And the only reason I haven't explored it further is because, with the RISA, it became its own ecosystem in and of itself. And I just don't have time to splinter off on passion projects right now, if you will. But that's definitely something that I would love to kind of take a look at, because if you can find that switch, I think that's huge.
Yeah, it's a great book. We'll link it here in the show notes, and I'll send it to you offline as well. Well, Alex, as we start to wrap up, this is a show about retirement. So I'd like to know what retirement means to you at this point in your life. Obviously pickleball, but what else?
Freedom.
I
think I see this a lot. I'm 52 right now. Obviously, I got a lot in me, that kind of thing. But I have a lot of buddies, especially government employees, that literally have a countdown for how much time before they don't need to work and on all this thing. And the idea, the underlying message, I think, is what they're doing right now is drudgery, and they get to finally have this freedom. Whether they do or not, that's debatable, because I think you're creatures of habit.
So that's that inertia thing again.
Yeah, kind of. But for me, freedom, retirement means that I've exhausted my human capital. What you're doing with working is you're mining your human capital. Right. I was educated. And so that gave me the ability to mine what I've learned. as human capital in terms of a job, right? Then as you start unwrapping towards retirement, the transition takes place either voluntarily or not, that the amount of human capital that you can mine starts to deplete. And so once that's done, hopefully you have invested capital and you're drawing your paycheck now from invested capital. To me, retirement is when that transition occurs, simply put, right? But, the freedom for me is it's not so much this magical number, but listen, I want to live within a certain standard of living, which is kind of what I have now. And if I can maintain that and have the flexibility to do certain projects according to what I want to do, I think that's great. Which, in a funny sort of way, it's not too different than, I'm very fortunate in my position, but it's not too different than where I am now, where I can pick and choose what I want to do, and play on with that. And I'd like to extend that into retirement as much as possible.
Well, that sounds like a great thing to look forward to for sure. And it's nice, I'm sure, that you've got the ability to do a little bit of that now just to kind of get a sense for what things may be to come in the future. You get to try them out a little bit ahead of time. If people are interested in reading the study that we've been talking about or in learning more about you or what you're up to these days, what's the best way for folks to find you?
The study, I would say, just put that in the show notes if you want, from that standpoint. If you want to know more about the RISA, I would say just, go to RISA, RISA profile.com and knock yourself out.
Great. Well, Alex, it's been a pleasure. It's always great catching up with you. Thank you for taking the time to join us today, and I'll talk to you again soon.
Hey, man, likewise. All righty.
That's all the time we have for today. For more information or a full list of episodes with show notes, visit myintelligentretirement.com. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any future episodes. And if you like what you're hearing, be sure to share us with a friend. We look forward to seeing you again next time on the Intelligent Retirement Podcast.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered tax, legal, or investment advice. Although the information has been gathered from sources that are believed to be reliable, please keep in mind that individual situations may vary. Therefore, the information should only be acted upon when coordinated with individual professional advice. Guest speakers and their firms are not affiliated with or endorsed by Park Avenue Securities, Guardian, Intelligent Retirement, or Consolidated Planning, and all views and opinions stated are their own. Guardian, its subsidiaries, agents, and employees do not provide tax, legal, or accounting advice. Consult your tax, legal, or accounting professional regarding your individual situation. All investments and investment strategies contain risk and may lose value. James Matthews is a registered principal and financial advisor of Park Avenue Securities, LC. Securities products and advisory services are offered through Park Avenue Securities, member FINRA, SIPC. James Matthews is a financial representative of the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, New York, New York. Park Avenue Securities is a wholly owned subsidiary of Guardian. Consolidated Planning and Intelligent Retirement are not affiliates or subsidiaries of Park Avenue Securities or Guardian. Compliance ID 79468391 expires May 2027.